It's the week ending Friday the 18th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the UK government dramatically taking control of British Steel's plant in Scunthorpe, Rory McIlroy finally completing his career Grand Slam, and Katy Perry becoming an astronaut. What a time to be alive. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in the Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Arion McNicoll. Let's unwrap the week. And a little earlier than usual because of the Easter holidays, joining me today from the Week's digital team, it's Rebekah Evans, and we also welcome back political journalist Catriona Stewart and freelance journalist and women's health campaigner Elizabeth Carr-Ellis. But before we get going, if not Katy Perry and Lauren Sanchez, who, Elizabeth, would you like to be stuck in a spaceship with and why?
Oh, easy, Chris Hemsworth. I mean, do I have to explain why?
No, that's entirely straightforward. Yeah. Rebekah, how about you?
Probably an astronaut, so I don't die.
Oh, good shout. Yeah, that's one thing that Chris Hemsworth might not be able to help you with, getting back to Earth, Elizabeth. Catriona, what about you?
There is literally nobody that I would want to be stuck in space with. I cannot think of anything more horrifying.
Don't you think alone is worse? I think alone is worse.
Yeah, I'm pretty good with my own company.
All right. Well, Rebekah, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Britain's libraries are grappling with a new issue: shelf control.
Because really the people might be protesting my book, but really what they're protesting is my existence or the existence of people like me. And it just makes me sad still that young people are still getting that kind of implicit messaging that they are something worth protesting.
That was writer Juno Dawson speaking on RTE in 2023. Rebekah, that was in Ireland. What's been happening closer to home?
So when you think of the idea of book bans, your mind might jump straight to the US. Maybe someone waving a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird in one hand and holding a pitchfork in the other. But here's the thing. It's not just an American issue anymore. An article in The Guardian this week revealed a worrying trend that's happening right here in the UK, and that's that librarians are reporting a growing number of requests to remove books from shelves. And these are not just dusty conspiracy books either, but titles with LGBTQ themes and books on race and identity.
And yet, with my history podcasting hat on, if you'll let me wear that for 1 second, I can confidently say that books have been subject to censorship and banning of various kinds in the UK since at least the 14th century or thereabouts. So what's unusual about what's happening now?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think there's quite a storied history, if you'll pardon the pun, about book bans that happen not only in the UK but obviously in the US and in the UK and overseas. But what I think is particularly interesting about this particular wave of book bans is the fact that demands and challenges are being made by organised groups, individuals and small groups of people, and that influence is coming from across the Atlantic in many cases. When we're thinking of book bans, a lot of our minds, as I mentioned, go to the US, but that influence from the US might be crossing the Atlantic in a way that we haven't quite seen before in the UK before.
And yet, Catriona, demands from the community are things that librarians have long had to consider. You know, part of a librarian's job is to think about the books that are going to best serve their community. It would be rare, for example, to have a collection that featured pornography. Aren't librarians always low-level censoring in a way?
They are, and some book publishers now are self-censoring. So there was the issue a couple of years ago with the changes that were made to a reprint of Roald Dahl's books because it was felt that they just didn't match current sensibilities. But I think the problem at the moment is that there isn't any settled view on what current sensibilities are. And one of the issues is that the books that are being targeted, and of course this is all anecdotal because there aren't any actual collections of data around this, but anecdotally it's books that pertain to the LGBTQ plus community. And obviously that's of huge concern because these communities have fought so hard for equality and they've fought hard for spaces in public life. And the idea that generally it's parents who are challenging this or religious groups who are asking for these books to be removed. It's one thing to have an expert librarian making decisions about this, and looking at books that suit their community. But when you have outside actors who are campaigning, who are putting pressure on librarians, that becomes quite a different situation.
So, Catriona, who are these action groups exactly? Who are the groups who are having success in censoring books in libraries in America? And what success have they had over there?
Well, in the US, there are evangelical Christian groups that are putting big pressure on libraries and school libraries in particular to remove certain LGBT plus books. There are, though, individual parents who are campaigning, and there's a man in Florida, in Clay County, Florida, called Bruce Friedman, who's become colloquially known as the Michael Jordan of book banning because he is so prolific and so successful. He's a father of one, he's 59, and his claim to fame is that he's successfully petitioned local libraries and schools to remove one book per day over the past 2.5 years. So the pressure is generally coming from political groups on the right, from religious groups on the right, but then you have these individual campaigners who are having a huge impact on their local school districts. Should one man have that kind of influence? I think most right-thinking people would say very much no.
And yet, Elizabeth, meanwhile, some people on the left want to censor themes of empire and racism, and then some people on the right want to limit access to LGBTQ plus titles like we're talking about. Between cancelling and deplatforming and public shaming and book banning, are we just entering a less tolerant, more censorious age?
I don't think so. I mean, books have, as you said, books have been banned throughout history. One of my favourite is Madame Bovary, and obviously that was banned because it was considered far too sexual and naughty for people to read. We had Candide, that was done for blasphemy, political sedition. It's really odd how many of these books end up actually being classics or considered classics and then put onto bestseller lists and to university reading books later. I mean, if you're talking about left and right, I think the whole ridiculousness of trying to censor books comes in the fact that 1984 has been banned for being anti-communist and pro-communist, both. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of George Orwell, but you've got to give the man a round of applause for being able to upset both sides of the argument that way.
I mean, Rebekah, you mentioned earlier that a lot of what's going on is based on anecdotal evidence. I mean, might it feel like there are more calls for censorship than there actually are, or are there actually hard stats supporting this?
Well, I think if we look back and into not too much of the distant past, really, there are some stats that support a kind of move towards arguably excessive book banning. So, for example, in 2024, the Index on Censorship found that 53% of librarians that they polled had been asked to remove books, and in more than half of those cases, books were actually taken off shelves. This is not just an issue of LGBTQ-themed books either. A 2023 study by CILIP found that a third of UK librarians had been asked by members of the public to censor or remove books, and this did identify themes of race and empire as among the most targeted alongside LGBTQ books and content. So it's clearly, although this particular study that I've brought this week is more anecdotal, there is clear evidence that this is something that appears to be on the rise, and perhaps that's worrying, particularly in the current political climate that we exist in.
Elizabeth, censors haven't always been on the right side of history, obviously, as with the examples that you were talking about earlier, but aren't they at least usually a pretty solid reflection of their age?
If you say the censorship is reflecting the morals of the time, then yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're good. And of course, it depends upon the morals of the individual country. For example, Nazi Germany burned books from everybody from Helen Keller to Albert Einstein, while at the same time they were giving Mein Kampf as wedding presents to newlyweds. I mean, that reflects their morals at the time, but I don't think we would necessarily say their morals are particularly good. I think the difference is now that people are taking it more on themselves to impose what they think is morally correct. We have to start realising that exposure does not equal endorsement. Just because you expose somebody to reading something does not mean that you endorse it.
But as well as that personal level of censoriousness that we're witnessing, Rebekah, there's also something particularly odd going on, it seems, at a kind of state-based level, especially in the United States. What's happening in the US Naval Academy's library? There's a particularly odd story there, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think it's going to be pretty emblematic of the Trump administration as a whole, really. I saw the story and I wasn't particularly surprised. And it's the fact that the US Naval Academy has recently removed 400 books from its library in what many are describing as a sort of anti-diversity purge. So gone are some of the familiar titles that would have been otherwise present, such as I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, which is a very moving memoir about racism and trauma. And similarly, gone are critiques of segregation and racism and examinations of the Holocaust. But ironically, and as Elizabeth just mentioned there with Mein Kampf has stayed within the US Naval Academy Library, and another book called The Camp of the Saints, which is commonly promoted by white supremacists. So these sorts of titles have remained, whilst critical race theory and books on segregation, racism and discrimination have been wiped. So I think if we're really going to talk about an agenda or an indoctrination of how people are viewing literature, we should probably start here, because we're looking at some problematic titles that have stayed, and whether you agree that they should stay or not is obviously entirely up to you. But the fact that diverse titles are being removed while these are staying raises some really worrying questions, I think.
When my mum immigrated to Australia in the 1970s, the Customs Department had the authority to stop imports, and they had a list of 15,000 books that were banned in Australia. But my mum said that they didn't tell you what they were, so she and her friends turned up at the airport, had their suitcases rifled through, and had all their books confiscated.
Wow. So
which is a kind of anecdote that I love, but it's not relevant to the podcast.
Yeah. Okay, well, we need to draw a line under, if not straight through that one. Up next, is there an upside to doom scrolling? That's after this. Catriona, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week should be remembered as the week when doom scrolling became dementia staving.
Like literally, she calls me to tell me she sent me an email. Every 2 hours, I sent you an email, son, did you get it? Son, I sent you an email, did you get it? 2 hours later, I sent you, Mom, email me, call me, you cannot do both. So, true story, I opened up her first email and said, here's my email, give me a call. What the heck?
Comedian Ron Pearson there, currently on tour in California, should our West Coast listeners be at a loose end. But Catriona, old people and tech, what's the story?
Well, most people have heard of brain rot and doom scrolling. And if you aren't aware of the concerns around children and young people and the effect of using digital services, then where have you been? For the past couple of years, there have been concerns raised around digital dementia, this idea that allowing our devices, whether that's smartphones or computers, to do a lot of our thinking for us is slowing our brains. But new research is challenging that idea. The first generation of people who grew up with tech is now approaching the age where they might start showing signs of dementia. And current thinking is that a lifetime of digital use damages cognitive function. But researchers in Texas have found that actually people in the over 50s category who regularly use smartphones and laptops have better than expected cognitive function. So, this week, do we need to rethink our negative perceptions of tech?
I mean, this does seem to fly in the face of everything that we've long presumed about tech and its impacts on the brain. Have we just been wrong about all of this the whole time?
I think that there is, as with so many things, a balance to be struck. I think there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence of people talking about the fact that they can't navigate maps anymore because they're so used to using Google to get around with, and I am one of those people, that we rely on search engines rather than looking things up manually. And doom scrolling is one of the worst. I mean, personally, I feel like my attention span is completely through the floor because I'm so used to just looking at little clips of things on TikTok. But these researchers at the University of Texas at Austin have done a wide-ranging study. So we've looked at 57 different studies, and that's more than 400,000 adults with an average age of about 68 years. And looking at all of those studies, they found absolutely no evidence to support the digital dementia hypothesis, and they ruled out outside factors such as health or socioeconomic background. And it found that digital devices keep your brain sharp if they're used in the right way. And that's why I'm saying there's a bit of balance to be struck here, because it did go to a certain point where if you were using your smartphone or your laptop too much, then the positive effects started to wear off and things slid in the wrong direction.
Elizabeth, this idea of tech potentially being able to sharpen the brain rather than the opposite, I mean, could technology fix brain rot, not just in older people, but in anybody, and contribute to cognition regardless of age?
I think it's what Catriona says. It depends upon how much you use it and how you use it as well. If you're just going to be watching pictures of cats on the internet, I don't really think that's going to help you with the brain rot. I mean, it certainly hasn't helped mine, that's for certain. I found it very interesting as well, looking at the positives, because, as Kat says, you know, we're so used to hearing about the negatives all the time. A study said that the over 50s who used it found they had a better social life, they were less lonely, there was a 9% reduction in depressive symptom scores. You know, and I was like, really? Using the internet can make you feel like that? But I know for myself as a campaigner, a lot of the friends I have now, I have met online on Twitter and the likes, because we have similar interests. And then we go for coffee and it's like you've met them yesterday. You know, it's like you've always been friends. Yeah. So I think we have to stop looking at technology as being bad and look at how we can bring out the most positive parts of it, for definite.
Rebekah, you can interpret this question either broadly or specifically, but what are we meant to do when confronted with seemingly conflicting scientific research? You know, there have been numerous studies that have pointed to the phenomenon of digital dementia being a real thing. Does this study then supersede those, or can both exist simultaneously in some kind of weird state of cognitively dissonant harmony?
Yeah, I think it's hard, because a lot of, you know, when we're looking at all of these studies, you'll see a study come out one week that says red wine is actually really good for you, and then and the next week it will be red wine is actually really bad for you, and if you drink it you'll die. So it's very difficult to kind of strike a balance when there's conflicting information. I totally understand that, but as both Kat and Elizabeth have touched upon, I think it really is just about balance, right? It's about harnessing technology in a way that's positive for all of us. I think we can pretty much safely say that doom scrolling is probably a bad idea, because it does what it says on the tin. It's pretty awful. And yes, I'm guilty of it. I think most people are guilty of it to some degree. But I think what's so important with the way that we use tech, particularly for older people in the future, is harnessing it for the purposes of healthy aging, is integrating it into our lives in a beneficial way. So I think we're really on the cusp of sort of a major shift in the way that we think about aging and technology. I think that for a long time the narrative has been that tech is something that younger people just get and older generations will just struggle with. But I think this research that Kat's brought to the table is challenging that in a really powerful way. I think it's suggesting that digital engagement isn't just manageable for older adults, it's actually beneficial. And, you know, we could see a future where tech could be fully integrated into what we understand as healthy aging. We might see health plans that can kind of integrate digital tasks into people's daily lives. Brain training doesn't have to just be like Sudoku and puzzles and crosswords, although, you know, over 50s, that is not that old. But if we're looking towards the kind of older demographic, sedentary activity doesn't have to be the only thing. If we invest in technology now, if we look into digital tech spaces, we can make tech truly integrated into the lives of older people in a beneficial way that hopefully staves off dementia and other brain-related illnesses.
Yeah, that idea of incorporating digital into older people's lives reminds me, Catriona, of this long-running study into nuns. I don't know if you've heard about this, how this group of nuns were able to perform their duties well into their 90s, but scientists later discovered that they all had quite late-stage Alzheimer's. It was the routine, as it were, that kept them active even as other aspects of their brains started to deteriorate. I mean, how much of that is what's happening in this new digital study?
The nun study is fascinating. So the researchers wanted to study nuns because the variables around them hardly changed. They lived in the same places for a long time. They didn't have a lot of interference from outside factors. And there was one nun in particular, Sister Mary, who at the age of 101, her brain scans showed that she did have signs of Alzheimer's. She had plaque in her brain, which would be an indicator of cognitive decline, but actually she was still sharp as a tack. And they found that brains can have cognitive reserves that help overcome the challenges that dementia and Alzheimer's bring. But there was something else about that I found quite interesting that sort of interweaves with what we're talking about. One of the benefits of being online, of using digital technology, is that it helps keep you connected. And we know that isolation is detrimental to your mental well-being and your cognitive state. And I wonder if partly it's because these nuns lived together and were constantly socialising and had people around them all of the time. You know, on a personal level, my mum is deaf, so I've never been able to speak to her on the phone. And all of my friends' parents phone them up all the time, but I can't have that sort of communication with my mum. And during the pandemic, she was completely isolated, so I got her an iPad. And I taught her how to use FaceTime, which has been a blessing and a curse because now she phones me all of the time. But I saw the sort of decline in her cognitive function during and just after the pandemic. But having this way of communicating has been really beneficial. I think we also have to remember as well that not all older people are online. Some struggle to use the technology. Age UK say that they carried out a study recently that found that 31% of over 60s, which they say is around 5.1 million people, say that life is really hard now compared to 5 years ago because a lot of the things that we want to do are online. So I think there does need to be a lot of support for older people to use these technologies.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, isn't it, Elizabeth? Who gets left out? You know, not all older people have devices or access or even in some cases the digital literacy to get started, and not all younger people for that matter. Are there some brains that are going to be left behind here?
2.3 million over 65s don't use the internet, and 48% of them are over 75s. So when you have access to NHS services, for example, which are becoming increasingly more online, they just can't get to it. And as you said, younger people too are finding themselves cut out. A survey in 2023 found that 14% of 8 to 25-year-olds lacked access to a device suitable for learning, for example. A few years ago, I was at a Smart City conference in China, and there was a very interesting talk about internet usage from one of the executives who was working in New York at the time. And she was talking about Link NYC, which was turning New York phone booths into Wi-Fi hotspots. And she says somebody had contacted her because they had just finished their degree purely by using the Wi-Fi that was free and publicly available. I thought that was a brilliant idea. It stayed with me all these years later, and it would be great to see something similar. You know, we have loads of old phone boxes in Britain. Let's turn them into public Wi-Fi spaces so people who can't afford to have broadband can get it, definitely.
I mean, Rebekah, is this actually a tech story, or is it something about connection and stimulation and engagement and learning that we're talking about here that promotes brain function, not devices and technology per se?
I think it's a bit of both, really, because obviously we've touched upon how essential communication can be, and I think particularly the pandemic showed us that. It helped a lot of people, just like Kat identified, to see that their older relatives and friends are perhaps cut off in a way that they don't really realise, because I think younger generations kind of take tech for granted, particularly if we've had tech in our lives since the start or for most of our adult lives. We take it as kind of second nature, and a lot of these digital tasks seem kind of mundane, like filling in a form or booking a GP appointment or something like that. But for older people who might not have that kind of similar relationship with tech, it can be not only just a barrier to leap over, but once that barrier is conquered, I think it can be really beneficial. So I think the story, yes, is about tech at its base, but it's also about all of the things that technology can provide for people, whether they are an older generation or not.
Catriona, do you imagine in the future we're going to see doctors prescribing tech devices, phones and computers and laptops and iPads, to people in a bid to prevent cognitive decline?
I think it's quite difficult to predict that sort of future for the NHS in particular, because there are so many basics that need to be rectified first. But in Scotland, there are local authorities that give iPads to all pupils, and not only the iPads, but they give facilities for charging, they give access to Wi-Fi at home. And there was huge resistance to that, but actually they've managed to put safeguards in place to make sure that this tech use is really effective. It's had a big impact in the classroom, and it has given the kind of social equity that was lacking before, particularly in very socioeconomically deprived areas of Scotland. And so if education can do this, then medicine may very well follow.
Okay, well, next up, another slightly counterintuitive story. Why downing 650 pints could be a good thing. That's after this. Elizabeth, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we calling time on the demise of the pub?
I'm here at the Gun Quarters, Birmingham, at the Gunmaker's Arms, down a pint of our locally brewed ale from the Two Towers Brewery. Can you count 3, 2, 1 for me, please?
3, 2, 1.
Thank you.
That was former MP's assistant Jay Chan downing a pint in that dead air right there, who has pledged to down a pint actually in all 650 UK constituencies as part of a campaign to support pubs. Elizabeth, why is he doing this?
I wasn't only impressed that he can down a pint in 8 seconds, but I'm impressed because he's doing it as the parliamentary group has launched an inquiry into the important role of beer and pubs in British life and how it can drive economic growth. And this comes after a very worrying report from CAMRA that found that 303 pubs have closed this year in England, Scotland and Wales, and around 1,000 closed last year across the country too.
Okay, so pubs closing in the UK, that's hardly a new story, nor are efforts to try to save them entirely. What's different about what's going on this time?
What's different is they are actually looking at it in terms of the economic importance that beer and pubs have to British life. The beer and pub industry has over 1 million jobs in it, and it contributes 28.1 billion to the economy. That is a huge amount of money that we can't afford to lose. And also I think the community aspect of pubs is certainly being viewed as much more importantly these days too, and that's why I have to admit to a personal interest in this. My mum and sister have both worked as barmaids, and my nephew used to own 2 pubs. He now only has 1 because of the financial troubles and the difficulties that pubs are going through. For example, his electricity bill went up from £2,000 a month to £9,000 a month just for electricity in one bar. So they had to cut down, and that's why he's gone from having 2 bars to 1 bar. His is a local pub. It's in Newcastle, which everybody thinks of nightlife and wild times and parties. But his is a proper local community pub. They host book groups, for example. They do things for children. They do events for dogs. at Christmas, he used to open just for his old regulars who would have nobody else to have Christmas lunch with, and they had Christmas lunch in his pub. And we are seeing this, we're seeing a huge amount of community pubs opening up as well. The most recent one, I've just found out, was a 200-year-old pub in Wigtown in Scotland that's been saved. And there's been a rise of more than 60% in the amount of communities that are saving their local pubs in the last 5 years, as people recognise that they're not just places to go and get drunk, they're places where you have a real community feel.
Yeah, so Rebekah, if the likely recommendation from all of this is that pubs should be supported because of not only their contribution to the economy, but because of what Elizabeth's talking about, their contribution to communities, what sort of support from the government are this working group likely to recommend?
Well, I think there's been a number of issues that pubs have faced, particularly in recent years, and I think COVID is obviously the one that obviously springs to mind, the fact that they lost so much revenue. But pubs are still facing real challenges to just even keep the doors open, really. I think we're looking at issues like alcohol duty and VAT and business rates. I mean, studies show that an estimated £1 in every £3 goes straight to the taxman from the publican's pocket, which is obviously a huge issue in just running a business. I think a lot of people just it's easy to see pubs as just a place that you go to have a drink and socialise, but obviously they are businesses that people have to fight on a daily basis to keep open. So I think when it comes to the government looking at issues like these, I think that there needs to be proper intervention, a real recognition of the issues that pubs have faced: COVID, Brexit, tax, the cost of living crisis, and really working with publicans to address these issues.
Catriona, not everyone has that relationship, that lifelong relationship with pubs. There may be people listening to this who have frankly not stepped inside a boozer for years or even at all. Isn't that a good thing?
I think one of the issues here is that there would be a lack of real political will to try and make a difference and turn around the fortunes of pubs. So again, looking from a Scottish perspective, the latest figures that we have from 2023 recorded the highest number of alcohol-specific deaths in Scotland since 2008. And that is despite consistent pressure from campaign groups for the Scottish Government to implement changes that are going to reduce these numbers. And they are some of the highest figures in Europe. We're talking about 20 people a week dying from alcohol-specific causes. And Scotland has declared this a public health emergency. There were heavy drinking patterns established during the pandemic that haven't been addressed. Issues have been raised, such as minimum unit pricing, to try and tackle the most problematic drinking. Supporting businesses is obviously important. They bring vital revenue for the public purse, they support local economies, they bring jobs into areas, but they aren't a social space for everybody. People do find drink culture problematic. They don't want to socialise in pubs. We know that younger generations are not that interested in drinking, and there's been a glut of dry nightclubs, and these things have massive knock-on effects in the sector. And I think all the kind of agonised conversations that we have about drinking culture are not really taking us any further forward.
Elizabeth, would it be possible, do you think, to hit some of those issues with drinking itself head on by just reimagining what the local pub can be? You know, to keep the same service but in a non-booze format. Could cafes, which are hugely in growth in the UK, for example, not perform the same role? Or is there something unique and irreplaceable about pubs themselves, do you think?
Coming from a family who are so closely connected to them, I would say straight away they are unique and special and we should protect them. But a lot of them are. I mean, my nephew's pub, you can get coffee there and he serves great coffee. Kat has talked about the negative impact of alcohol, but we have to remember that pubs are where you are less likely to get served if you're drunk than a supermarket, for example. A licensee, a pub licensee, will not risk losing his licence because he's serving somebody who he deems to have drank too much. Yeah. Certainly not a community one and a local one. They are more likely to encourage responsible drinking. You hear about pubs where they have free soft drinks for the person who's driving, for example. It's a mistaken belief that pubs are the reason why people drink. They can see it much more than just in an off-licence, where I know in parts of England you can buy a pint of Stella for £1.50.
Yeah. And yet, Rebekah, I can't help but feel that part of what is going on here is the prevalence of big TVs and streaming services, everyone learning to make their own bread and coffee, and beer and wine subscriptions bringing all our favourite drinks to the home. Haven't we just made being at home more fun over the years?
I think that definitely is a part of the issue that we're facing, but I think essentially what the crux of this is the fact that we don't value pubs and their staff enough. Or at least we don't value them in perhaps the way that we should. I think that clearly shows up in the barriers to recruitment within the pub industry. I think the inquiry that Elizabeth is mentioning here is going to examine those barriers. But I think the answers really are right in front of us, other than kind of home culture. We're looking at low pay, unpredictable hours, limited protections for staff, and overall just a general sense that hospitality work is sort of less than. It's not a career. It's just something that you fall into or you do for a short period of time, and that is not always the case. I think this kind of perception is the reason why pubs struggle to attract and retain staff. But as we've touched upon here, pubs have such a cultural value at the heart of their communities, and they function as a social lifeline for a lot of people. So I think matching the social value that we have for pubs with the economic value that we have for pubs is a real important thing that we need to address going forward. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to run into the same recruitment and retention issues. You know, it's not just about filling the shift with someone that can pull a decent pint. It's about changing the way that we think about the pub as an entity, as well as pub culture, you know, that going out culture sort of thing, rather than just staying at home all the time. I think cost has a big part to play in that.
Catriona, Rebekah said there that maybe we don't value pubs highly enough, but is there a danger in romanticising pubs too much? They are, after all, houses of sin and vice, but maybe that's why they are good.
What kind of pubs are you hanging out in? Sin and vice? I don't think there is a danger of over-romanticising pubs. I think nostalgia and attachment to places is how we protect those places. Cafe culture is rising across the UK, but cafes tend to close at certain times of night, whereas pubs are part of a community. They're a centre that people can use. And I don't see a problem with that, because I think the nature of pubs is changing. There are a couple of pubs near me that have games nights or who host chess tournaments and who are trying to do different things to bring people in for various reasons. And we've just been talking about the effect that social isolation can have on older people, that it can have on cognitive function. It is really important that we have these public spaces. They don't necessarily have to be based around alcohol, but I don't think we have to demonise alcohol either. I think there has to be a way of getting to a point where we can have a sensible drinking culture that more reflects the one on the continent rather than the one that you and I are probably used to in Australia, or the American drinking culture. There has to be a better way forward.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I'm sure Catriona's right that we don't need to demonise the drinking part of going to the pub, but what is your favourite non-alcohol related part of the pub experience?
The people. I've just recently moved back to Scotland, and my local pub, can I put a shout out for it? Cobby's Inn in Tayport, sure. Please. It is, one of them said themselves the other day, they are a family amongst themselves. It's a small place, there's only 4,000 people live here, and the pub is very much a place where you can go and meet people and find people, and even after a few weeks we're able to walk down the street now and say hello to people and chat to them, which we wouldn't have been able to without good old Cobbies.
Rebekah?
Yeah, I would have to agree with Elizabeth. I mean, when we were in journalism college, we were always taught, if you want a story, go into a pub. Like, that's the best place to find a good story, is to go into a pub and talk to people. It's such a social experience that I think it would be a shame to kind of let that go. It is unique in a way that, you know, bars and cafes perhaps aren't. Maybe less so in London, but I think particularly in kind of local communities and rural communities, pubs are, as I mentioned earlier, a real social lifeline. And yeah, that's what's unique about pubs, really. I think it's a great thing that we should keep within our culture.
And Catriona?
I mean, it feels irresponsible to say it after the conversation we've been having, but I like drinking. I love having a cocktail. I do. And I feel like I should be ashamed. But my local pub, there are 2 local pubs where I live, in fact. And I know that any night of the week, if I am feeling a bit lonely or isolated, or if I've got nothing doing, I can go along to one of those pubs and there will be somebody there that I know that I can socialise with and have fun with. And I think that's a really important thing, as well as a decent Negroni.
Yeah, very important. I'm afraid I'm going to have to call last orders on this episode. My thanks to Rebekah, Elizabeth and Catriona. And you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and then tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription. Just go to theweek.com/subscriptions. And Olly will be back from his big American adventure next week. No doubt he's drunk lots of Negronis over there, but in the meantime, I've been Arion McNicoll. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.